heard my story, so I'll be on my way. I hear a Frisco freight train, it's calling out to me. When the sun sinks in the west, in the dark blue sky, say that I'm a hobo, and I will be till I die. Yodelee, yodelee, yodelee.
This is the main street in quiet little Shenandoah, Iowa, nestled in the Nishnabotna River Valley in the southwest corner of the state. Shenandoah today appears much the same as it did in 1924, the year the two rival businessmen, Earl May and Henry Field, each decided to build his own radio station. These two men, seedsmen, entrepreneurs, promoters, would fill the silent sky with their voices and light up the heartland with a magic spark of radio. For the next 2 decades, their powerful stations, KMA and KFNF, would make Little Shenandoah the entertainment capital of the Midlands. The voices they brought to the air, singers, musicians, preachers, farmers, homemakers, magicians, and comedians, still reverberate in the soul of this small community and the entire rural Midwest. Earl May and Henry Field were in the seed and nursery trade, Shenandoah's primary industry. Henry was already a master seedsman, well established in the business for over 30 years. Earl May was just starting out with an ambitious and optimistic eye on a bright future. Both were on a collision course with a newfangled technology, radio, which would not only transform their seed and nursery businesses overnight, but would propel them to the forefront of broadcasting pioneers. In 1924, Henry Field took to the air over radio station KFNF, the Friendly Farmers Station, housed in the 3rd floor of his seed house. The following year, Earl May powered up his radio station, KMA, the Corn Belt station in the heart of the nation. Both Henry and Earl were destined to become legends in radio for their friendly and expert advice, for their outrageous promotions and feats of salesmanship, and for their down-home Midwestern sincerity. These legends were built upon an unshakable belief in giving people what they wanted: music, news, advice, and information.
It was Bible. I mean, they taught us everything we needed. And I think anybody would tell you, anybody of my vintage would tell you, that radio, probably next to the family, was the most important thing in their life. Kept you from being lonely, for one thing. It still does. Radio still is a great dispeller of loneliness, and it was very much that. And of course, it was information. We didn't have the newspaper at our door each morning. We couldn't refer to that, and there was no other way you were going to know what's happening if you didn't listen to the radio. So you listened.
Live radio was spontaneous. It was sincere, and there was feeling in the songs that the entertainers sang. Great feeling. And there was emotion at times too, but it was the feeling that you had that people enjoyed that.
If Henry and Earl supplied the vision, it was left to a legion of others, entertainers and musicians, announcers and homemakers, to bring that vision into the homes of listeners across the prairie on a daily basis. From those early days in 1924 until the closing of radio's golden age in the mid-1950s, entertainers and homemakers at KFNF and KMA broke down the barriers of isolation and loneliness that stretched across the vast expanse of American farmland. Throughout the Great Depression, the horrors of a world war, and the beginnings of the nuclear age, this dedicated band of amateurs and professionals became a beacon that pointed the way to a common heritage, shared values, and a sense of a community no longer divided by distance.
And they felt like this was their station, and it really was. The Friendly Farmer Station, KFNF, keep friends never fail, kind friends never fail. They had all kinds of things that they called this, and the seeds that yield are sold by field, and we had all kinds of slogans.
In 1924, the radio industry was in its infancy. Henry Field and Earl May had only their instinct to guide them when it came to figuring out what people wanted to hear. At first, everything that went on the air was an experiment, But the experiments worked. Shows were not nearly as refined and polished as in later years, but the early programming on KMA and KFNF laid the groundwork for what listening audiences would hear for the next several decades. And most exciting of all, it was entirely live.
Live talent, I really enjoyed that because you had no script to follow. You went into the program. Most of the single entertainer shows were 15 minutes in length. And they would sing songs and gospel music, and I would do the announcing, and I would also tell about some events that were happening that day.
Before the coming of phonographs and records, if families wanted to hear music, they had to make it themselves. Consequently, there was a ready supply of fairly accomplished singers and musicians eager to perform on radio. Most were amateurs, and few were formally trained at all. But the listening audience, scattered over a vast expanse of farmland, didn't seem to mind. To them, the music was more than just a novelty. It was like manna from heaven. For Henry Field, news, advice on farming and gardening, talks on every aspect of home life, old-time music, especially fiddling, and religious programs were what his listeners wanted. Henry's own noontime talks, called The Letter Basket, became an instant hit and formed the center of the programming schedule. The audience was already familiar with Henry's practical advice through his Seed Sense pamphlet, which for 12 years had been standard reading material in the farm. It came as no surprise that farmers flocked to their radios to listen to his voice.
I think I'll pick Spanish as my favorite spinach.
For entertainers, Henry looked to his family and his seed house employees. The janitor fiddled, the secretary sang. Pate Simmons, head of the farm seed department, became the popular announcer whom Henry affectionately called the hired hand. Almost immediately, he pressed 4 of his 5 sisters into service. Jessie Shambaugh, founder of the 4-H clubs and the county superintendent of schools, discussed child training on her KFNF talks. Henry's youngest sister, Susan Conrad, was a respected potter and promoter of the arts and craft movement. Sister Helen Fisher gave talks on flowers, expanding on her published works on the subject. But the most famous was Sister Leanna Driftmeyer, mother of 7 children. She began in a program started by Helen called The Mother's Hour. At first, though, she was reluctant when Henry called on her to join the family in broadcasting.
So he told her he wanted to have a woman on, he wanted her to come down and do a woman's program. And Mother said, good heavens, I wouldn't have any idea. You know, this scared her. And he says, any woman with 7 children can find enough to talk about. And that's the way it started. And she started on this program, which was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was for an hour, and they called it the Mother's Hour.
Leanna joined Helen on the Mother's Hour, and she took over the program completely in 1926 and changed the name to Kitchen Clatter, which went on to become the longest-running show in radio history, 60 years. What started off as a series of informal talks blossomed into one of the staples of farm broadcasting even to this day, Homemaker shows.
And it was just this and that, poetry, and the basis of most of the Homemakers programs are their mail. The letters that they get, they read parts of the letters and everything on their program. And so this brings them into it too, you see. You never saw them, but it, you know, unless they came, and of course they came by the thousands, you couldn't remember their names.
Henry's eldest son, Frank Field, also served as an announcer. Frank grew up in the seed business and became renowned for his excellent show gardens. And by 1926, he began a regular morning broadcast featuring weather service forecasts, spiced up with his own inimitable predictions, along with a short visit about gardening. Frank became nearly as legendary as his father, and he continued to give advice in the air for 50 years, first on KFNF, then on KMA, and eventually on KMTV, the May family television station in Omaha. But the heart of KFNF programming was the 2-hour concert heard each Monday through Saturday. The program featured old-time fiddling, harmonica, guitar playing, and a healthy dose of hillbilly singing mixed with antics by the musicians. Almost everyone featured on these concerts was an amateur, and almost anyone was welcome to try out. The concerts not only attracted listeners, but after the construction of the new KFNF auditorium, a regular studio audience was always on hand too. The entertainment was free to the public, and the people thronged to Shenandoah to see their favorite performers or to loudly applaud their friends and family who entered the amateur contests.
So anyway, I got up and tried to sing a song called Look Down That Lonesome Road. Maybe some of you oldsters have heard it. Chances are the kids haven't, but that was one of my favorite songs. And I got up and I was ready to sing it, and I opened my mouth and nothing came out. And that's the first time that ever happened to me, and it may be the last, because I've talked quite a lot since. But I couldn't sing, and I left the stage crying. And Mr. Field came over, Henry Field, came over and grabbed my shoulders, and he said, "Young lady, you get out there and you sing that song. If it's the last thing you do, you're going to sing that song." So he scared me, so I did. And I got the prize. And you can't imagine what the first prize was, $15, which was lots of money to somebody in my position on the farm, helping Dad milk the cows and all that, you know. So it was that part of glory that I got that day, I think, that made me want to stay in it. After you win something, you want to keep on doing it, you know.
Religion was another facet of Midwestern life that was vital to Henry and his Bible Belt listeners. The Reverend James Pearson, former Lieutenant Governor of Nebraska and state legislator, became the popular newsboy, bringing listeners news 2 or 3 times a day. The Reverend also held Sunday devotional services and officiated at the weddings of hundreds of couples who took up Henry Field's offer of a bridal bouquet, a discount on a ring, and a free lunch for anyone who wanted to be married over the airwaves.
He would give a little news, and then he would give a Bible reading or two. And then some of the ladies that worked in the seed house during the day, they would come in early without pay and sing songs.
Henry also brought the fiery evangelist Billy Sunday to town, and on another occasion the controversial Amy Semple McPherson made an appearance, both drawing enormous crowds. And KFNF also started one of the earliest series on radio, Pumpkin Valley.
It occurred every night at 8 o'clock from 8 to 15, and it was written by Dixie McKinstry on the staff. He was one of the entertainers, and it was called Pumpkin Valley. And it told about a certain family, their trials and tribulations. And after each episode, you could hardly wait for the next night to see what was going to happen.
Over at KMA, Earl May tried to reach the same rural and small-town audiences. Shrewdly competitive Earl knew KMA had to offer listeners something a little different than KFNF. KMA prided itself on a more genteel type of music. The Elysian Symphony Orchestra, the KMA String Trio, the Delmonico Hotel Dreamers, all made up of local music teachers and amateurs, of course. Typical of the early KMA performers, local dentist J.D. Bellamy, who not only played the cello in all musical groups, but along with high school principal Grady Fort, worked up a comedy act called the How Do You Do Boys. These amateurs were paid little or nothing. The thrill of appearing on the radio was reward enough for Shenandoah citizens. Although the performers were local, the radio audience was far-flung. On the night of October 30th, 1925, when Earl May turned up his power to see just how far his signal would go, the Delmonico Orchestra was heard clearly in Honolulu, and the How Do You Do Boys, Doc and Grady, were picked up in Melbourne, Australia, 10,000 miles away.
It was nothing to get 200 or 300 calls of an evening while they were broadcasting. So that one girl sat there and did nothing but answer the telephone because people were so excited that they were getting KFNF clear on the East Coast or clear out in California. It was even going across the mountains. These radio stations didn't have all that power, but they didn't have any competition either. So they were really getting places.
When Earl May completed his elaborate Mayfair Auditorium in 1927, he began to seek out professional entertainers, especially those displaced by the dwindling Chautauqua and vaudeville circuits. exotic dancers and singers, musicians and lecturers began to appear on the Mayfair stage and on the streets of Shenandoah. Radio audiences thrilled to the adventures of James W. Wilt, a rugged outdoorsman and a mountaineer who billed himself as the poet of the Rockies. Reading his original poetry in a program called Life in the Wild, Wilt sold 22,000 copies of his books during his first KMA engagement. Listeners got a healthy dose of culture from speakers like the Honorable George Van Houten, a world traveler, who it was said could lecture on any subject. One of the more striking features at KMA was a mysterious Rosa Rosario, said to have been born into a wealthy Spanish family and educated in Europe. In America, she always appeared attired in full Spanish costume, laden with ornate, dangling jewelry. The KMA auditorium was packed daily with crowds who came to see the strange and exciting foreigners. Melroy, a mind reader, Marja, son of India, the Halioli Hawaiians with shapely mignon inner grass skirt, Fuilo from China, the lovely Gary sisters from Hungary, and Count von Elsky from Russia. Earl took an active pleasure in serving as announcer for many KMA programs, as well as giving market closings, weather forecasts, reports on farm and garden topics. A gifted talker and salesman, Earl May was the most popular radio personality in the Midwest. Earl's wife, Gertrude May, also took a guiding role in developing KMA programming. In many ways, she was a prototype for the early radio talent. She did everything. She performed as a singer and musician. She served as announcer and saleswoman. She organized early broadcasts and persuaded capable women to perform. Her friend Lena Ferguson, the flower lady, was the first woman to have a featured program on KMA. Gertrude May's dignity and prestige made radio entertaining a respectable pursuit for Shenandoah women and girls. One typical staffer was Jessie Young, who appeared with her husband Floyd on a regular musical program in 1926. Later, Jessie's duties expanded to include a talk show called Stitch and Chat. She was the first full-time KMA homemaker and one of KMA's best salespersons. Another early staff member was Bernice Currier, a longtime May family friend. A trained musician, Bernice joined the KMA orchestra in 1927. One day, while on the air, Earl asked Bernice what she thought about some of the shirts that were on sale in the May store. Her impromptu answer so impressed Earl that he added announcing and selling to her list of duties. Before long, Bernice had her own program, Home Hour. She continued as a violinist and KMA music director, but Bernice is best remembered for her 25-year career as one of KMA's most beloved homemakers. Despite the tremendous success KMA enjoyed with the variety of talent and information it offered listeners, the most popular show consisted of old-fashioned down-home fun and unabashed corn pone. Inspired by his own experiences as a rural teacher, Earl conceived the KMA Country School District No. 9, starring Earl as the teacher. Of course, there was nothing educational about the show. It was vaudeville brought to the airways, and the audience loved the hilarious skits, the rambunctious classroom antics, the pantomimes, the dancers and magicians, and, of course, the corny jokes. Oddly enough, much of the humor was visual, leaving the radio listeners to imagine what was causing the uproarious laughter.
And everybody had funnies to tell, and Greta was one of them. And Greta had everybody has to have a little thing that is their thing, you know. Hers was her bloomers kept falling down, and the bloomer leg would fall clear down to her ankles, and she'd be very busy controlling her clothing as she was singing her song or telling her stories, and everyone loved her. She was something else. We had some Chautauqua people, too. Toby Stewart and his wife, Linda. She did what she called the lick skillet hop, and danced kind of a little hoedown dance to things. And Toby was an old-fashioned vaudeville man, and he just told stories and ran the show. They were fun people.
The fact that much of Country School's humor was lost on radio audiences didn't diminish the show's popularity. Country School was a forerunner of classic radio comedy programs like Fibber McGee and Molly and Amos and Andy. Country School ran for 18 years, from 1924 to 1942. Over 4,000 performances were given before the show was curtailed as a result of gas rationing during World War II. Religious programming had its place on KMA, too. Edith Sterling, dubbed the Little Minister by Earl, was KMA's Director of Welfare. Edith moved over to KMA from KFNF, and like many others, she started out as an entertainer.
When she first came to KFNF, she was singing ballads, country music. She played a ukulele and a guitar, and the organ sometimes. And she had so many letters from people who were shut in and elderly that one time she went to Leanna Driftmeyer and she said, I have so many people write to me that are shut-ins, and she said, I think somebody should start a program for them, just especially for the shut-ins. And Leanna said, I think that's a good idea. Why don't you do it? So that's how she started her SOS program, Send Out Sunshine.
Eventually, she became an ordained minister. Earl asked her to take charge of religious programs on KMA, and she accepted because she felt it was closer to her true calling. Her Send Out Sunshine Club included over 30,000 members, many overseas. For over 50 years, she opened each program with her trademark salutation. Greetings, friends in Radio Land everywhere, and may peace be in your heart. The 1920s was a decade of pioneering and new beginnings in radio. The 30s saw the radio industry mature, and with that maturity came a transition to professional talent. However, professional only meant that the radio stations had paid entertainers on the staff. It did not mean that the entertainers were always professionally trained. Many were homegrown musicians who came out from the Ozarks, Kentucky, Texas, Alabama, and Tennessee to find a spot in front of a mic. Some were trained and versatile musicians, but many were not.
Well, some of it was so horrible it was almost unforgivable that it was played, but it was there and it got on the air. The music was basically, well, it started, I think, with gospel. And then it went on into the black gospel and into the other kinds of music from the musicians who came to us with their music. See, they just sat here like sitting ducks, and the musicians came in, and they interviewed them, and then they auditioned them. And the auditions were just a kill. We kids, after we were in radio, see, we were suddenly successful, and we'd go snitching around the corner so we could hear the auditions and giggle and carry on because we knew we were better than that, you know. But we weren't always. And some pretty fine people came out of the auditions right here in Shenandoah, Iowa.
One who first auditioned in Shenandoah was Al Slowey, a young Irish tenor from nearby Tarkio, Missouri. He joined a group called the Noveliers on KMA and later went to Hollywood to the Writers of the Purple Sage, an enormously successful Western trio who appeared in many movies with Roy Rogers and were featured performers on NBC's popular Hollywood Barn Dance program. Their recordings of such ballads as Tumbling Tumbleweeds became Western standards. Another popular group that went on to stardom, the Blackwood Brothers, a gospel quartet that headquartered in Shenandoah for over 10 years before moving on to Memphis, the center of the growing recording industry. James Blackwood has received 28 straight Grammy nominations and has won the coveted award 9 times. But Al Slowey and the Blackwoods were the exception. Few radio entertainers made it to the big time. For most country musicians in the early days, Shenandoah was the big time. In the heyday of live radio, KMA employed as many as 50 staff musicians, most of them able and adaptable performers who found in radio a place to practice their trade and earn a meager living at it. Several remained long enough to be fondly remembered by Midwestern listeners. Minor Kleitz, a blind piano player, and Phelan Geist, an accomplished organist, first established their reputations in Shenandoah and then moved on. The local Carter sisters, Helen and Margaret, married traveling musicians Stan Rucker and Pete Tavora, touring the world as USO entertainers before returning to Shenandoah. But most of these radio musicians passed into obscurity.
The early days, of course, we had a lot of live talent at Henry Field's. We had such individuals as Jimmy Morgan, the boy from old Kentucky, and I always appreciated Jimmy because he taught me a lot about announcing live talent shows. There was Jess Gaddis, who was known as Kentucky Jess. There was Garland Hutchins, the boy with the golden voice, Zag Pennell, Buck and Cleo Dilley. Buck was a great fiddler. There was Wilbur Smith. Many, many years he was a fiddler and an entertainer on KFNF. There were the Maxwell sisters, Curly Dale. His real name was Lowell Schuler, but his radio name was Curly Dale. And at one time, shortly after World War II, we had 22 live entertainers on the payroll. In addition to that, we had about a half a dozen radio announcers and 4 or 5 engineers, plus the office staff.
During the 30s, hundreds of performers paraded in front of the mic at KFNF and KMA. Shenandoah was like a magnet, especially for aspiring newcomers, since picking and singing seemed to be one form of entertainment that families could afford during the Depression days. It wasn't surprising that entertainers came in pairs and whole families. The Carson sisters, the Shoemate brothers, the Soflin sisters, the Dickerson girls, Mac and Jeannie Sanders, May and Oma West. The supply of family acts was endless. Live radio, like vaudeville before it, was a training ground for most musicians. Radio families like the Haydens learned their skills on small stations like KMA and KFNF. The parents had a 6 a.m. show, the Hayden children did a 6:30 show, and the whole Hayden clan joined together for a 7 a.m. show before the children went to school. Little Charlie Hayden, who started in radio at the age of 3, became a famous and highly respected jazz bassist. Typical of these itinerant musical families were Ike and Margaret Everly, who came from Muhlenberg County in Kentucky with their 2 little boys, Don and Phil. Ike was a studio musician, an accomplished guitar player who learned traditional bluegrass style from his father. To increase the meager family income, Margaret also learned to sing and play, and as soon as the boys were big enough to sing, they joined the family act.
In the early 1950s, the Everly family moved over to KFNF from KMA, and they broadcast as a family at 6 a.m. in the morning for 1 hour. It was Ike and Margaret Everly and their 2 boys, Phil and Don. Well, of course, at that particular time, Don and Phil were just youngsters still in school. And getting those boys up that early, I shall always remember, they were a little blurry-eyed yet, getting there at 6 o'clock in the morning in order to do a show.
Working 6 shows a week with adult studio musicians, the Everly brothers were seasoned professionals by the age of 14. Those close harmonies and lightning guitar rhythms of the Everly brothers reflect the gospel and bluegrass traditions of early radio. One of the very first families to appear on Shenandoah radio was the Rubies. Floyd Ruby is still performing with his old-timers band at the age of 90.
We put on a program, a father and mother, and my 3 brothers and a sister, 2 brothers and a sister. I was counting myself as one of the brothers. Why, we was all pretty good musicians for those days, and Henry Field said we got the most messages of any group that had ever been on the air. Of course, we could all read music, play by ear most anyway, and my dad was a wonderful guitar player, played the old Spanish-type guitar as well as chording or anything else. And my mother, she played the piano, and my sister played the piano. And my older brother played the violin, and my younger brother played the banjo and guitar later, and I played the trumpet and the violin.
Almost none of the so-called professionals were able to make it without supplementing their income in some fashion. Many raced off from their daily stint on the radio to play for a dance in a small town, often 100 to 200 miles away. Entertainers were able to trade in their celebrity status to book live appearances.
We went in Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, all over Iowa here in the western part, just to, say around 250 miles to the city here, about as far out as we got. Because it'd be too far to drive. We'd maybe have to play a program here at 6 o'clock on the radio and then go to Denison, Iowa and play a dance that night. Well, they didn't have decent roads in those days, mostly dirt. If we hit a little gravel, we was tickled to death. So I got to be known as the fastest driver in the country, and I think I was, and it wasn't to be silly like these young kids are now. I had to be there. And I might knock on wood and say that, near as I can figure, I've driven around 3 million miles without one accident.
Some musicians managed to get corporate sponsorship and became identified with certain products like Sparkolite, Vitamix, and Aladdin kerosene lamps. The immensely popular Blackwood brothers were paid no salary for their daily gospel programs. Their entire income was from the sale of songbooks and hymnals and a grueling schedule of concerts and personal appearances, as many as 9 or 10 times a week. The group was so busy, they formed a second quartet to fill the demand for concert dates. Other entertainers continued to work in the seed and radio business in other capacities. Most of the time, there were also plenty of non-entertaining responsibilities that went along with the job.
Oh yeah, everyone did things. Well, for instance, at KFNF, we were in the middle of a seed house, and Mr. Field was a seedsman. And if anybody had any extra time, we were out packaging seeds or peddling seeds and doing the things that had to be done in the place there, because we were a part of that place.
In most cases, the radio stations tried to make few musicians seem like money. Any entertainer might appear on several programs each day, wearing a different hat or name, or even playing a different instrument. Versatility was the key.
For instance, I always played guitar with the old-timers, the fiddlers and stuff, and then I could play enough piano to accompany the old-time fiddlers. Now, they're kind of hard to accompany. The rhythm is usually pretty fast and everything. I got that down pretty pat, and I played enough bull fiddles so that if I was with the Bohemian band or something like this, I could fill in for a couple or 3 tunes, give a guy a chance to get off the stage for a few minutes.
We played with a trio was the main thing, but then they had this Ulrich and his wife. They had the Farnham trio. They played high-class music. Well, we'd sit in and played with them. Then they had an old-time orchestra we played with, and then there's a fellow by the name of Pearlie Clark who used to play with Sousa and some of the big bands back east, came in here as an old-time fiddler with a fella. And so he organized a 15-piece band that I'll swear sounded as good as most of them big ones on the air in them days. We played in that. And any group that they had there, now the high school band used to come down and play. Well, they'd get to going like this here and go off the air. They have to shut them off the air because they get all messed up. So then about 5 of us, regular entertainers there, set into the high school band. When they go to getting off, well, we just blow a little bit louder and bring them back. So we played in the high school band even.
We did that for each other, exchanged and interchanged, and we all learned to play each other's instruments just for the fun of it.
In those early days, there were no sophisticated audience measurement tools or rating services. Audience response was gauged chiefly by monitoring direct responses, phone calls, telegrams, and most importantly, mail.
Lena Sandman was our lady in charge of the mail at KFNF for many, many years. And in the morning when she started to distribute the mail, you could see all these entertainers going to see Lena, because that is basically what they lived on, was the mail from the public to let them know how they were doing. And of course the announcers enjoyed it too, because they wanted the advertising that they were doing to bring results.
There was a lot that came in the mail because of the farm department. When Frank Field was on KMA, he and Leanna Driftmeyer and the other homemakers would almost battle over who was going to get the most mail today. And sometimes Frank would, and sometimes Leanna would, or sometimes Florence Falk would, whoever maybe had struck a chord at that moment. When Leanna talked about angel food cake, she got 1,700 letters saying, "We made your angel food cake, we liked it."
Well, here's one from a listener at Council Bluffs, Iowa. I've been listening to Here Comes the Band program for a long time, and I think it is a wonderful program. Keep up the good work. Here's one that was sent to Jimmy Morgan, the boy from old Kentucky. And it says, I enjoy hearing Mel talk because he has such a hearty laugh, and I'm sorry to hear that he's leaving for the service. I have 4 grandsons in the Army now and 1 overseas. Jimmy, please sing the Old Rugged Cross on your morning program, and please send me the 5-way life insurance policy.
Entertainers lived and died with the weekly mail count, and when listener mail slacked off, it was a sign to move on to another station or listening area.
You know, they'd stay till they didn't draw any mail, and maybe they'd want to go to a bigger station or something like that, and then they would move on. But never owned anything, just their car and their clothes and instruments. And most of them didn't stay too long, you know, in one place.
Because entertainers were itinerant gypsy-like troubadours, they often received a welcome that was less than warm. Despite the activity and prosperity that radio brought to Shenandoah, entertainers were often greeted as second-class citizens and regarded with the same suspicion that followed circus folk and traveling salesmen. For many, growing up around and often on the radio presented difficulties too. Most of the young kids shunned the limelight and all the fuss of presenting a public face. Others only realized years later that growing up in the aura surrounding radio entertainers and homemakers was not exactly normal Midwestern living.
There was another program that Uncle Henry asked Mother to have, and that was a morning worship hour on Saturday, a family time. And so we children would sing on that and participate. We all learned to sing parts very early because if the voices were changing, sometimes, you know, we even filled in with the boys, you know. And so we all learned to read parts and could sing all the hymns in Uncle Henry's hymnal, radio hymnal that he'd gotten out. All the songs came from there. And Mother would have a scripture and some prayers, and so we had a nice little time. Well, our children, if they came home, if we went to the football game, Mother would always say when we went out the door, now don't you yell too loud at the football game, so you're in good voice in the morning. And if little friends came home to stay with us overnight, you know, they got to go down and sit there and watch us. So when we had our morning worship time, and this was something quite unusual, I think, and unique in its day.
I think I probably complained more than my sisters did. I'd say, but Mama, I can't sing. I had to play some kind of a ukulele or something too. And she'd always say, well, it's not the people with the talent that are on radio. It's those that have the most nerve. I didn't have much nerve either. I hated it. And I'd look out at the crowd and I'd hope, oh, I hope there's nobody out there that knows me. And I hope there's nobody listening on the radio. And if many of my friends did, why, they were real nice about it, and they didn't tease me or say anything about it very often.
Much of the early radio programming began to disappear in the 50s as television emerged and recording technology became more sophisticated. Live music gave way to recorded music, while comedy and variety shows migrated to television. But in a sense, homemaker shows were always pure radio, and they've remained a staple of radio stations in the Midwest even today. In the early years, radio hurdled the boundaries of distance and allowed women on the farm to come together in a way they never dreamed possible. For these women, homemaker shows were about sharing.
It honestly would be impossible to exaggerate the importance of the radio homemakers in the lives of the women. The very beginning of Radio Homemakers, which started in 24 and 25 in Shenandoah, with the very first women that came on with recipes and household hints, and they were sharing not only those ideas, but they shared their lives. And this was one of the secrets of the Radio Homemakers. It was almost like today's soap operas, except they were real. They told what their kids were doing. They would sit there, and many of the microphones were in the homes, so they actually would be sitting at their kitchen table. And they would share what they'd eaten, what they had cooked the night before for dinner, what the kids had been doing, what their husband had been doing. And it was just as if they were sitting there being a neighbor. In fact, neighboring is what the homemakers did in the early days of radio. And it continued for a long, long time, and much of it is still, in some respects, continuing today.
Leading the way for Homemakers was Henry Field's sister, Leanna Driftmeyer, who reached the hearts of those isolated women with her neighborly visits on KFNF. It was a brush with tragedy in 1930 that changed Leanna Driftmeyer's life and at the same time transformed radio homemaker programs. A serious auto accident left Leanna paralyzed. She'd be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. Determined to continue her daily visits to the radio audience, Leanna had Henry install a radio line to her home so she could broadcast from her bedside during her long recovery. Afterwards, she simply moved the mic into the kitchen where she continued to broadcast. By broadcasting directly from home, Leanna brought an immediacy to kitchen clatter that couldn't be achieved in the studio. And by sharing her personal pain and inviting the audience into the story of her life, she developed a rapport with women that went far beyond recipes and household hints. Jessie Young, the #1 Homemakers rival KMA, was the first to follow Leanna's lead and install a microphone in her kitchen. She specialized in giving recipes and was not afraid to parade her failures as well as her successes in front of her audiences.
But one of the rules on kitchen clatter was that every recipe you gave had to have been tested. And the person who gave that recipe had to be the one that had tested it so that they could tell them exactly how it went together. And if you had a failure with something, it was always good to tell them. They loved it because they had failures too, and gee, that made us just like them.
And this was wonderful. Adela Shoemaker used to say it was so great. She'd be out in the kitchen making ketchup. Time to go on. Didn't even take her apron off. She'd go in the little sunroom where she had her microphone. Very lovely, sunny place, and sit down and tell the ladies, I've been out in the kitchen making ketchup and still have some on my apron. And then she would just talk as if they were sitting right there across the desk from her, which was one of the reasons that made it so timely.
Homemaker programs filled the broadcast day at both stations. KMA employed as many as 5 live homemakers at one time: Bernice Currier, Edith Hansen, Evelyn Birkby, Doris Murphy, and Adela Shoemaker, each with their own distinctive personality and point of view. The women frequently moved back and forth between stations, taking their loyal listeners and advertisers with them. KFNF may have been the first to include regular broadcasts in the home, but in 1949, KMA became the first to offer a live homemaker show from a bona fide farm. Florence Falk first appeared in the KMA studio to tell her harrowing tale of a tornado that devastated her farm home near Essex. Her folksy, colorful charm struck such a chord in radio listeners that KMA called upon her to fill the spot vacated by Adela Shoemaker. Engineers strung 7 miles of wire to her farm home. She always referred to her husband on the air simply as the farmer and talked to the antics of the family dog Tippy. She broadcast on KMA until 1963, then continued on KFNF and KOAK in Red Oak until her retirement in 1975. Like the Seed House side of the broadcasting business, Homemakers didn't limit themselves to just radio to communicate with listeners. At first, early homemakers like Jessie Young and Leanna Driftmeyer began publishing newsletters as a way of answering the huge amount of mail they received. Before long, these simple, erratically published newsletters developed into colorful monthly magazines that became almost as important as the radio programs they supported.
People were writing in and wanting some of these things. So Mother decided that she would collect the best of things that she had given, like recipes or just little articles. And it was only 4 pages at that time. And she called it the Mother's Hour Letter. And she'd have this printed. And people got it by sending in 10 cents in a stamped addressed envelope. And when we came home from school in the afternoons, it was our job to fold up the magazine and put it in these little tiny, we hated these little bitty envelopes they sent. And it grew till at one point it was almost 200,000. And that went out every month. Then we became monthly and went out every month. And all of us, all of the family, cooperated with it. We all wrote for it.
So powerful was the Homemakers' influence that many companies approached established homemakers with lucrative syndication deals. Homemakers would promote company products and use them on their programs. The Tidy House Company, founded by former KMA staffers Cy Rapp and Al Ramsey, syndicated Edith Hanson, a KMA homemaker, to over 90 stations east of the Rockies.
I remember once Uncle Henry saying to Mother that she could sell anything. You just, if you can't sell it, give it to Leanna because she can sell it. She was a good salesman and not even aware that she was a good salesman. But she could, they could give her about anything to sell, and she always could sell it. She was very, very good salesman.
And the women had great credibility. Just as someone who trusted their neighbor, they trusted Adela. She had a Georgie Porgy account for a while. They bought Georgie Porgy cereal like crazy. When Kitchen Clatter told about their flavorings, they would go out and buy it in droves. Jessie Young sold soap. And whatever brand of soap she had, they would go and get. Bernice Courier told one time, because Ed May had gotten a truck, not a truckload, a train carload. This is when stuff came in on the trains. A train carload of prunes. And so Bernice came on with recipes for using prunes. They sold out and had to order some more. I mean, their credibility was just amazing.
And you see, Kitchen Clatter developed its own line of products too. We had our line of laundry detergent, bleach, and things like this. We had a line of household flavorings that was under the Kitchen Clatter name, brand name. And then later we did our own publishing of the magazine, and then we were able, with our own publishing, then we could put out cookbooks and other party books and things of this type. So we did expand. Things spawned out of the Kitchen Clatter.
After Leanna's summer retirement in 1959, her daughters continued to run the Kitchen Clatter organization until 1986, when Kitchen Clatter finally retired from the air after 60 years of continuous broadcasting. As women vacated the home and joined the workforce en masse, the old-fashioned homemakers became an endangered species, so much so that they have become the topic of historical research. Recognized nationally for her writing in this field, Evelyn Birkby started as a newspaper columnist. She had her own radio program briefly and served as a standby radio homemaker for over 30 years, filling in when needed. Her acquaintance with the many KMA and KFNF women broadcasters has provided material for her history of radio homemakers called Neighboring on the Air.
You think of radio as being just a box that sits on a counter, maybe in a kitchen or someplace like this. Okay, when the radio homemakers came into the home through that box, through that crystal set at the beginning, through the very fine modern radios today, they become people. They become personalities. They become friends. They become neighbors.
And they watched us grow up. And then they watched us from the time we got married and had our own children. And then they watched our grandchildren, because it had been such a continuous thing. I've always thought about it as the old radio program called One Man's Family that just went on and on and on. Well, this is the same effect that Kitchen Clatter had on people.
It was something that was unique, and I have a feeling that the intensity of it and the way in which it expanded into the lives of so many people in such an important way was unique to this area, these two radio stations, and to the people that were here.
We've been off the air now for 6 years, and I get telephone calls from all over the country wanting to know where everybody is, who's gotten married and who's had children. It's something that's very hard to explain, because how people could get that attached to you, you know.
In many ways, the story of radio homemakers is a story of radio itself. Using a new medium designed to reach vast numbers of people at one time, radio homemakers managed to touch listeners' lives in a very personal way. The story of radio entertainers could be summed up in the life of Billy Oakley, the sole surviving live homemaker in Shenandoah. Honored by the National Association of Broadcasters in 1989 with the first Marconi Award for Excellence in Radio, Billy's starting toward her 60th year in broadcasting. Singer, traveling musician, copywriter, saleswoman, talk show hostess, and syndicated homemaker over a 40-station network, Billy's done it all. From the age of 15, when she won Henry Field's amateur contest, Billy has been an eyewitness to the golden age of live radio.
I think I've had the best of all times, frankly. When I look back to starting in 1932 and making myself still active up this far, I've had the best of all there was.
Henry Field and Earl May helped a generation of Americans tied to the land share and celebrate the values of honesty, integrity, openness, and caring. They brought a parade of voices in front of the microphones that spoke a language native to the Midwest, a language of music and song, friendly chatter, folksy heartfelt wisdom, and sincere advice. The astonishing amount of talent that kept audiences entertained and informed for nearly 3 decades of live radio is a testament to the enduring vitality of the rural Midwest. If you happen upon Main Street in Shenandoah, Iowa, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echoes of the golden age of radio reverberating gently through the air.
Give the world a smile each day, helping someone on life's way. From the paths of sin, bring the wanderers into the Master's fold to stay.
Help to cheer the lone and sad, help to make some pilgrim glad. Let your life so be that all the world may see the joy of serving Jesus with a smile. Are you giving to the world a smile, helping lessen someone's dreary mile? Do you greet the world with song as through life you pass along, cheering those whom you may meet along life's way?
Give the world a smile each day, helping someone on life's way. From the paths of sin, bring the wanderers into the Master's fold to stay.
Help to cheer the lone and sad, help to make some pilgrim glad. Let your life so be that all the world may see the joy of serving Jesus with a smile.